The first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz is considered the father of positional chess. However, in his youth he played romantic chess, and the following game is a good example of that. His opponent made mistakes in the opening and fell behind in development, which let Steinitz carry out a deadly attack which ended with a violent queen sacrifice and immediate checkmate. White started with e4 and Steinitz played e5, knight f3 knight c6, and white played the Scotch game, d4. Steinitz captured on d4, and now the main move for white is of course to immediately recapture the pawn. However, in our game white opted for the Scotch gambit instead, which is perfectly playable of course. So instead of immediately returning the pawn, white develops the bishop and attacks black's main weakness, the pawn on f7. Steinitz plays bishop c5, developing his bishop and defending d4 pawn. Now the pawn is untouchable. And here comes white's first inaccuracy. White castles kingside, which looks like a natural move. However, it would have been much better to play more actively, namely c3, threatening to capture on d4 and build a strong pawn center with tempo, attacking the bishop. And in case black accepts the pawn sacrifice by capturing on c3, there is a standard bishop sacrifice on f7, followed by the double attack, queen d5 check, and white immediately returns the sacrificed piece by capturing the bishop, and the black king would lose the right to castle in this case. So c3 would have been much better than castle kingside, which was the case in the game. And Steinitz plays d6, opening his light-squared bishop's diagonal. And only now white plays c3, which isn't as effective as it was a move before. Of course, Steinitz didn't capture on c3 because after knight takes c3 for a sacrificed pawn, white would have a better development and initiative, but instead, as the bishop's diagonal is open, he pins the very important knight, which was attacking the pawn on d4. And of course now white cannot capture the pawn because of simple knight takes d4, and black would attack the pinned knight for the second time, which would be very unpleasant. So white played queen b3 with the double attack, attacking both f7 and b7. However, the queen was defending the knight on d1, and now that the queen moved from d1, the knight is unguarded, and Steinitz immediately exploits this. He lets white capture on f7 with check, but captures the knight on f3. And after white captures the pawn on f7, white will be forced to capture the bishop, and that would lead to the destruction of the pawn structure of the king side. And the white king has already castled kingside, and that means the white king will be in trouble. But after bishop takes f7, the black king isn't safe either, because Steinitz loses the right to castling, king f8. And now comes a much more serious mistake by white. White decided to exchange his valuable light-squared bishop, which has already made two moves, bishop c4 and bishop takes f7, for the knight which hasn't made a single move, and white captured on g8. Instead, it would have been much better, of course, to capture the bishop, g takes f. Probably black was scared of knight a5, because the knight would attack the queen, and the queen is the only defender of the bishop. However, in this case, white would play simply queen e6, and the queen still is defending the bishop. So white played bishop takes g8, which is a terrible mistake, because after rook takes g8 and g takes f, we can see that the only developed white piece is the queen. White's queen side isn't developed at all, while black pieces are much more active and black is much better developed. However, black has his own problems. It's not clear how Steinitz is going to develop his rook, which is currently very passively placed, and the black king is also unsafe. However, with his next move, Steinitz solves both of these problems. A very strong move, g5. Now the rook from a passive piece turns into a very important piece. It is supporting the very important pawn and creates very unpleasant x-ray. And the pawn on g5 is playing a very important role. It controls the f4 square, and thanks to this, the knight will occupy the central blockading square, and white won't be able to push it away by playing f4, because as soon as white plays f4, black would simply capture with the g5 pawn. and that would also open the g file, which would lead to terrible consequences for white. Besides that, the pawn is limiting white's dark squared bishop, and also after g5 the g7 square is vacated for the king, and Steinitz is going to move his king to h8, and on h8 it would be much safer and better placed. Besides that, after the king leaves the f8 square, the second rook will come into play with great effect, rook f8, exerting very unpleasant pressure on the half-open f-file. So, what to do now? If white captures on b7, then simply knight e5, and white queen is far away from the king side, it isn't doing anything, white queen side isn't developed, and white king is all alone on the king side, and white's king side is damaged, and black is immediately attacking f3, and black starts a very strong attack on the white king. Probably the best move for white would have been knight d2, starting to think about the development of the queen side. But instead of this, white played queen e6. And Steinitz, of course, now that the g5 pawn controls f4 and white cannot play f4, Steinitz centralizes his knight, knight e5. Now the knight is greatly placed and it is attacking the f3. So white played queen f5 check and defended the pawn, and also white is attacking the g5 pawn. However, Steinitz still played king g7. It looks like white can capture the pawn on g5 because the king is blocking the rook's file, and the only defender of the g5 pawn is the queen, and white is attacking the pawn twice with his queen and the bishop. However, of course, white cannot capture with the queen because of simple king h8, and the queen would be pinned and lost. However, white could have captured with the bishop, but still it would be much better for black because of simple knight takes f3 check with a fork, and white will be forced to capture the knight, but after that the bishop is unguarded, so queen takes g5 check, and for example after queen g3, king h8, the exchange of the queens, king h1 and rook f8, black is much better. Black rooks are extremely active, black is attacking white's weakness on f2, the king is cut on the g file, and white's queen side is still undeveloped, and the bishop is also very strong. So this position, of course, would be in black's favor. That's why after king g7, white played king h1, moving the king from this unpleasant x-ray and vacating the g1 square for his rook. And Steinitz moves his king to the corner, and now the rook again becomes very active and the pawn is protected. And white plays rook g1, attacking the pawn for the third time, as you see, and it's defended only twice with the rook and the queen. That's why Steinitz moves this pawn, g4. However, now that the pawn moved from g5, it isn't controlling the f4 square anymore, and white plays f4, now attacking the knight. Instead of f4, capturing the pawn would be a mistake because of simple queen h4, and white's position simply collapses because black will play rook f8 with tempo, attacking the queen, and f2 pawn is attacked twice after this, as you see. Besides that, g4 pawn is also under attack after queen h4. That's why after g4, white played f4. And as you see, the two defenders, the only two defenders of the g4 pawn are the knight and the rook. And white also is attacking this pawn twice with the queen and the rook. And now white is pushing away one of the defenders of this pawn, the knight. But Steinitz still plays knight f3, attacking the rook. But now the pawn is unguarded and white captures it. And it might seem that white has solved his problems. However, it's not the case. Steinitz's next move came like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. You can pause the video and try to find it. So he played queen h4, creating deadly threats. First, checkmating threat on h2, and second, attacking the g4 rook. And it turns out that white cannot capture the queen because the rook must stay on the g file. If the rook captures the queen, then simply rook g1 checkmate would follow. That's why, in order to parry both rooks, to parry the both threats, to save the rook and defend against the checkmate on h2, white played rook g2. Now h2 is protected. However, now the second queen sacrifice follows. Queen takes h2 check, forcing the rook to move away from the g file. And after rook takes h2, rook g1 checkmate followed. And now I recommend watching Steinitz's positional masterpiece, in which he got a space advantage, ensured a great blockading square for his knight, deprived his opponent of any counterplay, and eventually demolished his opponent's position. But first, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.